Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Hidden History of New England. I'm your host, Patrick, and today we're shining light on one of the most tragic and often overlooked events, not just within King Philip's War, but in the broader sweep of American history. This is the massacre at Peskeompskut, also known as the Battle of Turner's Falls, or the Great Falls Fight. This violent episode is one amongst many Native massacres throughout the centuries that have been marginalized or largely forgotten. Yet, this is essential to understanding the true complexity and cost of America's true colonial past. For those who may not be familiar, King Philip's War was the first major widespread conflict between English settlers and Native American tribes here in New England after the earlier Pequot War. At its core, Native peoples were fighting to defend their land, their autonomy, and traditional ways of life from relentless colonial expansion. For decades, settlers had been encroaching on indigenous territories, seizing land, disrupting their communities, and forcing many tribes into smaller, more isolated areas, and forcing natives to assimilate to their colonial ways of life. This mounting pressure set the stage for a devastating war that would reshape the region. By 1675, at the outbreak of King Philip's War, nearly 90% of the native population in New England had already been killed by European diseases, such as smallpox and measles. In the Massacre of Peskeompskut, which took place on May 19th of 1676, marked a brutal and pivotal moment in this devastating conflict between Native peoples and English colonists. And before we get into the event itself, it's important to understand the significance of the location of Peskeompskut. This was a native fishing village located on the Connecticut River in what is now modern-day Gill and Turner's Falls, Massachusetts. And for the Native American tribes who have lived, fished, and thrived here for thousands of years, this land has always held significant purpose, long before any English settler ever set foot there. Peskeompskut, which was located at the Great Falls on the Connecticut River, was much more than a strategic spot for trade and food. It was a cultural and spiritual center for the local native tribes. For thousands of years, it served as a gathering place primarily for the Peskeompskut people, along with other neighboring tribes such as the Nipmuc, Abenaki, Narragansett, Wampanoag, and others who would come together to trade, hunt, fish, and celebrate their traditions. Families camped there, cultivated crops, and thrived, maintaining a deep connection to the land that was central to their identity and survival. And by 1676, that once vibrant and thriving legacy of traditions was on the brink of collapse. King Philip's War had devastated local native populations and upended their way of life. What had once been a place of peace and cultural exchange had become a refuge, a safe haven for native families fleeing the relentless advance of English forces. And as the war intensified, English settlers and their native allies pressed even harder against indigenous lands, pushing communities further and further to the margins. So, by May of 1676, Peskeompskut saw a larger than usual gathering, as many native families sought shelter and solidarity during these turbulent times. We have to remember that King Philip's War was a brutal and devastating conflict, considered one of the bloodiest in American history relative to the population size at the time. Although often overshadowed in popular memory by later events like the American Revolution and the Civil War, its impact on New England was profound and long-lasting. The war was named after Metacommet, the Wampanoag leader better known as King Philip, son of Massasoit. And for those who don't know, Massasoit was the sachem who famously helped the Pilgrims survive their first harsh winter here in America. The war was born out of years of desperation and mounting fury. And tensions finally erupted in 1675 when a band of King Philip's warriors launched a fierce attack on the town of Swansea, Massachusetts, marking the beginning of the brutal conflict. And as the war dragged on, both sides grew increasingly desperate. While the English held advantages in weaponry and numbers, Native American fighters used their intimate knowledge of the land to adapt, relying on hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, and raids to challenge the settlers. By 1676, after months of fierce fighting, the tide was turning. The English were gaining the upper hand, and native resistance was becoming more fragmented. It was during this critical moment that the attack on Peskeompskut unfolded. On May 13, 1676, a group of native warriors from Peskeompskut raided farms in the nearby town of Hatfield, Massachusetts, stealing some cattle and livestock. The farmers, who had long lived in a state of fear and uncertainty, were caught off guard and outraged by the attack. Their response was swift and brutal, setting the stage for a violent escalation in this conflict. Local settlers decided to take matters into their own hands, and some days later, on May 18th of 1676, Captain William Turner, with Lieutenant Samuel Holyoke, gathered volunteers to raid the encampment at Peskeompskut. They gathered a force of around 160 soldiers, many mounted on horseback, and they set off for the village. It's important to note that at the time of the massacre, most of the warriors, if not all of them, were camped about a mile downriver on what is now known as Smead Island. What this meant was that the upper village of Peskeompskut, with its women, children, and elderly, was left vulnerable to attack. At around dawn on May 19th, the English soldiers reached a hill overlooking the village. The weather was rainy and they left their horses behind, and in total silence they began their descent toward the village. The attack came without warning. The unsuspecting victims, many of them asleep in their witus, their traditional dwellings, had no chance to defend themselves. Captain Turner's men opened fire, walking point-blank range to the witus and firing, killing women, children, and the elderly, showing absolutely no mercy. Some of those who survived the initial attack tried to escape by canoe or by swimming across the Connecticut River, but many were killed in the water, either shot, drowned, or swept over the dangerous falls. It was a horrific scene of desperation and loss. And by the end of the massacre, over 200 native women, children, and elderly lay dead along the shoreline and in the river. Following the slaughter, Captain Turner and his men burned the village to the ground. However, this action actually worked against them, as it gave the warriors camped downstream on Smead Island precious time to regroup and prepare a counterattack. The warriors camped on Smead Island heard the commotion and quickly mobilized. They rushed to the village and launched a fierce attack, turning the English's surprise assault into a deadly ambush that inflicted significant losses on Captain Turner's forces. As Turner and his men retreated to their horses, the native warriors closed in, launching attacks from the rear. The soldiers soon found themselves surrounded in a full ambush near what is now known as White Ash Swamp. Panic broke out, and Turner's forces scattered into smaller groups. Turner himself, along with a contingent of about 30 men, made their way toward a spot known as Green River Ford. It was there that the final, deadly ambush occurred, resulting in Turner and roughly 30 of his men being killed. We have to remember that what Turner and his men carried out at Peskeompskut was far from conventional warfare. It was a massacre. As they charged into the village, they killed indiscriminately, targeting women, children, and the elderly, those with no means to defend themselves. Many victims tried to escape by fleeing into the river, only to drown or be swept over the nearby falls. The scene was one of unimaginable horror, a brutal reminder of the devastating human cost of this conflict. The attack at Peskeompskut left a lasting wound on the English colonies. For many settlers, the sheer brutality, particularly the killing of women and children, sparked moral outrage. Questions arose. Was the war worth such violence? Was targeting innocent civilians justifiable? And in some communities, the raid marked a turning point, where the brutality of the conflict became too much to bear. For native communities, the massacre at Peskeompskut was a devastating loss, but it did not crush their spirit. Instead, in some ways, it galvanized them, strengthening their unity and determination to resist English encroachment. Before the massacre at Peskeompskut, the area had been a peaceful gathering place for native tribes for thousands of years. It was a vital center for trade, cultural exchange, celebration, and spiritual connection. A place where indigenous peoples could live in deep harmony with the land and its resources. But this ancient tradition was brutally shattered by the massacre, which transformed a site of community and peace into one of horrific violence. The attack not only caused immense loss of life, but also marked the end of a long-standing cultural practice. This tragic attack underscores a deeper truth. War is not merely a clash of armies, but a struggle over culture, identity, and survival. For thousands of years, Native Americans had lived on these lands peacefully, and in King Philip's War, they fought fiercely to protect their sovereignty, their land, and their way of life from relentless colonial encroachment. The indigenous people's resistance was not only about survival, but about the fundamental right to exist on their own terms and on their own ancestral lands. Native worlds have been irrevocably changed by colonization, and the injustices they faced continue to resonate far beyond the battlefield, shaping the history and realities of indigenous peoples and their cultures to this very day. As we reflect on the massacre at Peskeompskut and the broader history of indigenous resistance, it's important to recognize that these aren't just distant events from the past. They continue to shape how Native peoples are seen, treated, and valued in society today. Indigenous cultures, languages, and ways of knowing have survived centuries of violence, displacement, and attempts at erasure. Yet their contributions and struggles are often overlooked or marginalized in mainstream narratives. So, as we learn about these painful chapters, it's worth asking ourselves, how can we better acknowledge and honor Indigenous histories and their voices in our communities? And what steps can we take to support Indigenous sovereignty and cultural revitalization in the present day? And there is one final point that we need to confront honestly, because history does not end with the last musket shot. It lives on in how we choose to remember. Today, the town of Turner's Falls carries the name of Captain William Turner, the very man who led this massacre. And I believe that is a social injustice. Turner did not die in a fair or defensive battle. He led a dawn assault on a village largely occupied by women, children, and elders. Naming a town after him is not neutral. It is a choice that reflects whose lives were valued and whose suffering was dismissed. And when we commemorate figures without reckoning with their actions, we are not simply preserving history. We are shaping public memory. And in this case, we have honored a perpetrator, while the indigenous victims of Peskeompskut remain largely unnamed and unacknowledged. Reconsidering how we honor the past is not about erasing history. It is about telling the truth and aligning our public symbols with historical and moral reality. As we think about this period, let's not forget the human lives behind these events, the families and the cultures that were forever changed. I want to thank you for joining me today as we explored the tragic events of Peskeompskut. History is never easy. In complexities of war, the emotions, the motivations behind the decisions, these are things we cannot overlook. Until next time, this is Patrick, and thanks for listening to Hidden History of New England.